My name is Fredrik Larsson. I live in Sweden. I am the main organizer of this. It was my idea to make a webinar about a very interesting subject, especially for Sweden now. It's something we stumbled upon. This is a joint effort between Mossornas Vänner with the support of Swedish Botanical Society, the Norwegian Moseklubben, and the British Biological Society. And we tried to marketing through these community societies and in different ways. I think we have listeners from mostly Europe, but maybe abroad. So that's why we speak in a common language, English, and I'll use Swinglish, but I'll do my best. The background to this webinar is that we in Sweden stumbled upon something that looked very similar to vegetation habitats in Scotland, and for me and some others that we needed to reach abroad to get help to understand what this is. And by doing that, and I had an idea, it's a long winter where I live. It's 8 months of snow, so there's a lot of thinking and reading. So I thought that we could do a webinar for Sweden, but then why not host for everyone, even including Scotland and Ireland and so on. So we included all and sent to all the members, but it's free for everyone, of course. It's a lot of different names of this habitat. Hopefully we'll get a better understanding of that. The subject is boreal and oceanic liverwort heaths of Europe, but they do exist outside, and I think Rory will mention it a bit more about the worldwide distribution a bit. The purpose of this webinar is to increase the awareness of this world rare habitat where especially liverworts is the main ingredients. Especially in terms of nature conservation, to better really understand the importance of it. It's from my conclusion, it's a bit underrated compared to other habitats. And second, increase the collaboration across borders, of course, and that's already accomplished by trying to organize this. I've talked to these gentlemen. And I'm really sorry for it's for men. We tried to get more women, but it didn't work out. We have Anna who's helping us organize. That's it. Sorry. As I said, cues in the chat. I think you'll find it. It's in the bottom. We move on. So this is today's schedule. It's 2 hours with a break. So we start with introduction. That's me, and it's already started. So I'll soon finish. Then we have Rory from Ireland, and then Gus from Scotland, and we'll take a break around in an hour. Then after each, we'll try to stop, and the speaker will keep its presentation on, and we'll try to answer some question for a few minutes, and then we have to move on, of course. And the break is for 10 minutes around in an hour, and then we continue for another hour, and I'll do a short summary, and that's it. Anything else before we start? Okay, I'll stop sharing, and it's Rory coming up.
We even have people watching from California here, I see.
Okay, so can everyone see that? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, so firstly, thanks to Fredrik for inviting me to talk. So today I'm going to just give kind of a more of a, I suppose, an overview of the whole topic of liverwort heaths, hepatic mats from a very much an oceanic Irish perspective, because that's where I'm based, and I've worked on Irish liverwort heath and hepatic mats over the past, I guess, the stage past 15 to 20 years. So that's what I know, but I'm going to try and give the kind of the overall perspective and then talk a bit from an Irish perspective. So firstly, when we talk about Liverwort Heath hepatic mat, what are we talking about? So really we're kind of talking about any kind of a plant community that's dominated by liverwort, which is a very unusual thing because usually, you know, in most well, to even to have a bryophyte dominated habitat is rare enough, but even in oceanic areas, you know, to get a totally liverwort dominated habitat is something special. So when we talk about this habitat, these liverwort hepatic communities, really we're talking about where liverworts, first of all, you know, you have a liverworts dominating over, you know, a decent area, either, you know, not just patches of liverwort here and there, but a whole liverwort dominated plant community. And this, you know, first of all, you can look at it on a patch scale. So if you're looking at, you know, you might get where you have just patches of liverwort scattered over a slope or across an area, or you might get a whole landscape, which is, you know, carpeted liverworts over a very large area. So really, you know, when we're talking about hepatic communities, you know, this hepatic dominated vegetation, you know, we're talking about, you know, where you have liverwort as a dominant component. So this is a, well, this is a typical kind of, I suppose, from the west of Ireland, a slope where liverwort probably produces a, you know, a large amount of the biomass, and even from a distance, I think from about 300, 400 meters, you can spot the liverworts there. But here you can see these rusty orange cushions growing, you know, scattered up the slope all the way up. These are, well, Herbatus hutchinsiae, which is, as I'll show you later on, is a very important component of Irish liverwort dominated vegetation. So when we talk about, you know, well, what we're all going to be talking about today is different variations on this liverwort dominated vegetation. So firstly, just to talk about kind of a bit of geographical context. So in Europe, really, you know, well, to date, really, this well, just to talk about first of all, oceanic Europe or hyperoceanic Europe is basically, you know, defined as the very western fringe of Europe from the Micronesia down in the south up through Spain, Portugal, Ireland, Britain, Faroe Islands, and, you know, into southwest Norway is kind of considered the kind of the hyperoceanic fringe of Europe, which is, you know, really where, and actually before I go on, just really we're not going to be talking about vegetation that occurs south of Ireland. So Ireland's kind of the southern limit of this vegetation. There's probably analogous communities, you know, in the Micronesia and so on. Certainly there is, but it's not really been recognized in the past as being liverwort heath or you know, or being, you know, this community, which is very really not very well defined up to now. But so really generally, as I say, these communities have been thought to be, yeah, restricted mainly to this hyperoceanic fringe. But also, but interestingly now, from what Frederick has been finding and others in Sweden, you know, has been extending these liverwort dominated communities to the boreal area. So that's very interesting and very exciting, really. So anyway, I'll leave Frederick to talk about the boreal and Gus to a certain extent, and I'll just focus really on the oceanic vegetation for now. So really, I mean, if you look at, you know, if you think about it, you know, these communities grow in a very wide range of situations. So even in you know, temperate rainforests, you know, very oceanic woodlands, if you actually look at the ground flora, often they are liverwort dominated. This isn't really recognized as a hepatic community, but many of these really rich oceanic woodland communities in the far west of Ireland and Scotland and other parts of Britain as well, and up into particular, you know, if you look at the ground floor, if you were to take away the trees, it would basically be a hepatic dominated community. So you know, large liverworts forming mats across a wide area. So things like, this is Basania, Trilobata, Lepidosia cuprocina. So these two real distinctive, you know, oceanic woodland liverworts which form lovely mats, and also things like Plagiochylis species, this is Plagiochylis spinulosa. So you know, this is a type of hepatic mat, even if it's never really called that as such. And then in the south of Britain, in chalk and limestone grassland in the south of England and Wales, there's what's known as the southern hepatic mat. So again, a liverwort dominated, well, this is more kind of where they've got patches of liverwort dominated vegetation through grassland habitat, and with the species here, Scapania aspera, being a particularly particularly prominent member of that community, things like Frulania tamarisi and I think Perella arboris vitae. And this is, not so much liverwort dominated community, but where liverworts form a very distinctive component. And this is, it's documented from the south of England and from Wales, but probably actually occurs much more, well, a bit more widely anyway in the western fringe of Europe. But just to point, just to give you an idea of some of the variety of hepatic mat liverwort dominated vegetation, and then you get mats of various liverwort species in a variety of habitats, which may be dominated by what are more common, widespread oceanic liverwort species. So this is Scapania gracilis on the left, Diplophilum albicans on the right, and other things like Milia taylorii, Curtia species, maybe Curtia trichocladus, Lepidosia reptans, things like this can often form, quite extensive mats, but more on a scattered, mats here and there, and not forming, I suppose, a consistent species-rich community. But really, the jewel in the crown of the liverwort, oceanic liverwort dominated vegetation, and the one that's really been recognized for years and has been most well studied, is what's been variously called the mixed northern hepatic mat, or in Scotland particularly oceanic liverwort heath. So just to, so this is like a mix of often very species rich mix of species, which with a lot of very very restricted special liverwort species, and very beautiful, very colorful, and dominated by these large leafy liverwort species that most of them are restricted to this vegetation in Europe. So I think I'll just, so for the rest of mainly for the rest of my talk, I'm going to talk about this community. So just to give you some background on I suppose what this community liverworts needs to occur. I mean, it's all down to climate, both the macroclimate and the microclimate. So in terms of macroclimate, the key thing is constant high humidity. So if it dries out too much, then these species can't occur. So you need so it needs a very kind of constant climatic conditions. So the temperate oceanic climate that occurs in Ireland and the west of Scotland is perfect. So it doesn't get too warm in the summer, it doesn't get too cold in the winter, doesn't get much frost, and there's a lot of clouds, so there's not much sunshine, and it rains frequently. So it's this really the key thing that has been shown is the frequency of the rainfall. So this is a diagram that I really like from a classic paper on oceanic liverworts by the great Derek Ratcliffe back in 1968, and this diagram really just shows you really nicely how this community liverworts is really restricted to areas where you get more than 220 days with rain per year. So it really needs that, that really frequent constant rainfall, and without that it can't really survive. So this is, I'd say it's an old map, but it still holds today. And actually you can just see these couple of outliers in Scotland in the Cairngorms, which I think Gus will talk about later. That's more of a boreal occurrence, which is probably more similar to what occurs in Sweden. So that'll be interesting to see that link across from the western liverwort heath here across to the boreal, and how that relates to what occurs further north. And then there's equally important is the micro climate, the micro habitat as such. So this is one of the best habitat. It's one of the best sites for oceanic liverworts in Ireland. This is the highest mountain in Connacht in the west of Ireland, Real Ray. And this little glacial valley here, or corrie as we call it in Ireland, is home to some very, very nice stands of this vegetation. And the real, the key factors here are, first of all, you can see the seas very close there, so that's one thing. Then a bit of altitude. Generally, they occur at slightly higher altitudes, at least about 300, 400 meters, up to about 900 to 1,000 meters altitude. And then this is north facing, so north is up, is kind of to the right of the photo, and then there's these large cliffs behind and kind of across. So this just holds the humidity, holds the moisture, and really keeps the perfect environment for these species to grow. So this is kind of classic liverwort heath in Donegal in the northwest of Ireland. And you can see, all these mats of Hepatic hutchinsiae growing through under an open canopy of Calluna vulgaris, Erica cinerea, and a bit of vaccinium scattered through, so dwarf shrub heath. And as I say, in Ireland, Hepatic is the key hepatic species. But then it's interesting when you get to Scotland, Hepatic is still present, but not usually dominant in the same way. But also in the southwest of Ireland, where you get a lot of the same species and really nice communities, usually this community grows in the absence of dwarf shrubs. So where there once would have been dwarf shrub cover and once would have been forest going back even further, but now due to land, the history of land use, burning, overgrazing, and so on, there's no dwarf shrubs yet, because of the topography with the cliffs and the rocks also, to give that niche, you still get these same liverwort communities hanging on. So basically, because the climate's so humid, these communities are able to survive even in the absence of any kind of canopy. And then one of the most remarkable sites for this community is on Achill Island off the west coast of County Mayo. This is, what's claimed sometimes to be the highest sea cliff in Europe, 680 meters. But it's not really a cliff, it's just a very, very steep, heathy slope. But here at the very top of the cliff, I've explored under some of these rocky bluffs, and it's one of the richest sites for this vegetation there is. So when you get down to the vegetation, this is what you see, this really rich, beautiful mix of liverworts. So I think there's about maybe certainly about 7 or 8 species of liverwort in there, but the most special one here is this lovely species in the middle with the lovely reddish purple color and spines on its leaves, which is Scopania nimbosa, which is very rare indeed in Ireland. And this brings me on to the kind of the overall biogeography of these species. So if you look at the worldwide distribution of Scopania nimbosa, first of all, I just point out these dots on the map are indicative. So for example, that dot in Norway is probably not the exact location, but it's because Ireland, Scotland, very old record from Wales, southwest Norway, then this massive gap, and the next place it occurs is Himalayas, and also this one outlier on in Taiwan, I think that is. So there's this really disjunct distribution, which means that it basically occurs in these two very separate, disparate areas, but nowhere in between. And another species growing on those ledges is this lovely species Mastagophora woodsii, which has a similar disjunction there, but also occurs in the Pacific Northwest of North America, where again you got very similar conditions climatically to Northwest oceanic Europe, and then a couple of tropical occurrences in Mexico and the where was that? That was the Philippines possibly, and again this very interesting disjunct distribution. But in these tropical occurrences, it's always going to be growing in more montane cloud forest, so where the conditions are actually surprisingly similar to the conditions here in oceanic Northwest Europe. And then one more species, this isn't really a species presentation, but one more species to show you, which is one of my favorites and a real Irish specialty, really, is Adelanthus lindenbergianus. This lovely black liverwort here with the pale tips, and this species has a different. So, firstly, to give you its European distribution, it only occurs in a stronghold is west of Ireland, and then 2 sites in Scotland, which Gus might talk about, and then the nearest place then it occurs is nearly totally in the southern hemisphere. So again, a couple of tropical occurrences, Mexico, the tropical African mountains, and then this southern hemisphere polar distribution. And apparently on the Falkland Islands here, it actually occurs in similar communities in a hepatic mat, but with different species than it occurs within in Ireland and Scotland. So I won't go into, if you want to ask more questions later on about the origin of this disjunct distribution in these species, then do, but I won't go into that at the moment. And probably in not so much the Atlantis, but the other species, this is the kind of habitat maybe that they would occur in this in the tropical areas and in the Himalayas, the higher altitude cloud forest. This is a rhododendron forest in Sikkim, and I haven't seen these species in the Himalayas, but as far as I understand, it'd be similar habitat to this, but then in Ireland, we have very little trees, and in Scotland it's a similar, but changing, I guess. But these species probably would have been grown under trees at some point, but have adapted as things have changed. And just to finish up now, really, is just to talk about the threats to these species. So they're very much this community of liverworts and liverworts in general are very much vulnerable to change. So in Ireland and Scotland, and in particular, the habitats, all habitats, particularly in Ireland anyway, that are extremely modified by human activity. And in the habitat of these species, you're talking about, well, overgrazing, burning, have really changed the habitats. This is a site here in Connemara, 12 Bends Mountains of Connemara, which is one of only 2 Irish sites for the Liverwort Plagiocala carringtonia, which is the species that was my first slide. And it hasn't been seen there since 1984. But in the intervening time, in the 1990s in particular, there was severe overgrazing, and the habitats changed completely. So it's just a lot of bare soil, bare rock, and this species is nowhere to be found. So and this has been the same story across a lot of sites, and a lot of stands of this vegetation probably been lost without really being known about, but just hanging on, clinging on there. And yeah, so certainly very much diminished, but hanging in there. And then the other thing that may be a threat but hasn't really been looked into in detail is climate change. That as these species are so vulnerable, in time, they may well be may well, their range may contract. They may lose stands. And be threatened by climate change. But this is yet to be seen. So yeah, so rather than finishing on my part of the evening on a grim photo, I'll just finish with this photo of Scapanio ornithopodioides and Herbertus hutchinsiae. Scapanio ornithopodioides isn't a species I've spoken about, but another lovely hepatic species that's just restricted to this habitat. So hopefully that just gives kind of a bit of an introduction, a bit of an idea of the more oceanic version of this vegetation, and some of the issues and around this habitat and these species. So thank you.
Perfect. Wow. We need to go there. I see there are questions in the chat, so maybe we use that that way, and we try to use that. So I'll choose some questions here, and you can just sit back.
Okay.
Well, they say where they're from. Yeah. Do you know of any habitats dominated by tallowid liverworts?
Well, I don't actually. I mean, generally, I mean, thalloid liverworts. I know of places like where, say, Connocephalum connicum can cover like whole rock walls above streams, but I mean, an actual habitat or on a landscape scale, no. But I think thalloid liverworts are much more vulnerable to drying out. So with leafy liverworts, they can dry out a lot more and then rehydrate and to a certain extent. But most thalloid liverworts, they're more kind of, I suppose, well, from my experience anyway, they're more faithful to being near water. So then I suppose it's it's hard for them to occur on a wider habitat or landscape scale.
Yeah. I can't see any more questions, but Johannes says thank you.
I just, if I may, I'm not sure if everybody will know what thalloid liverworts are, so maybe just a few words of explanation for those who are more beginners in the subject.
Sure. Yeah. So yeah. So liverworts, basically there's two groups of liverworts. Morphologically. So the leafy liverworts and the thalloid liverworts. So the leafy liverworts are what you see on the screen there, where they're stem and leaves, whereas a thalloid liverwort isn't differentiated into stem and leaves and just grows as like a green mat basically. But otherwise, similar, I suppose, life strategies and so on, but very different look, physically as such. And I just see another question here from Brent Mishler. When I visited sites in far west London. Yeah, actually, that might be something. So basically asking that in Scotland, there was a big drought in 2018, and all the liverworts, were crispy and dry. And the question is, you doubt they're super desiccation tolerant. Have they recovered? And I haven't been to Scotland myself since then, but I mean, I think that, well, from my experience, that they probably a certain amount of desiccation would be tolerated, but not for a long period. So I mean, actually, that's something interesting because in Ireland, the droughts have never been quite as long as have occurred in Scotland or other parts of Britain. There was that one drought, I think 2022, I think it was even longer drought, and some of the oceanic communities were apparently looking really crispy. So it'd be interesting to see, know about that. Maybe if anyone in Scotland has any experience on that. They might chip in. I don't know if Gus would know or anyone else. And see, there's another couple of questions here. Okay, so there's a question from Jeanette Hall. Leading on from that, how far is desiccation in itself lethal, and how far might it reduce their ability to compete with more tolerant species? So yeah, I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, I'm not a physiologist, so I don't know how lethal desiccation itself would be, but I think that if they dry out for too long, they won't. They can't survive long periods. So I think that's for sure. But I wouldn't know how long that period is, and So, but certainly, it would be they wouldn't last for long, and certainly it does reduce their ability to compete. So desiccation, I think that's a big thing. Is that once they get out, these liverworts are outside of their nice humid niche, then their competitive ability goes down. And also with climate change, if you say the one projection is that there's going to be longer dry periods, and it's something we've been seeing a bit, and it's certainly that could be one thing that's likely. I think it's been seen in Scotland to a certain extent as more common species coming in, and the vegetation becoming more homogeneous. So the species being lost, then the more special rare species being lost, and the more tolerant species coming in. So certainly it's something that is likely that they are becoming less competitive.
I'll break your. I think it's time for Gus. Thank you, Rory.
Worries.
Yes. So if you stop sharing, Gus can take over.
Hang on. How do I stop? Is it? Hang on. How do I? No. Sorry. So it won't stop share. Is there a stop share button? Hang on.
Gus, I think you can start anyway and take over.
Hang on. Oh, there we go. It's gone now. Okay, I'll go.
Cool. Right. Can everybody hear me? Probably first thing.
Yes.
Nice. Right. Well, I think I'm basically following on from Rory. A very brief introduction. I'm an ecologist based in Scotland. I'm just south of Inverness at the moment. Quite active on social media, but I do a lot of habitat surveys in woodlands, peatlands, but generally focusing on sort of botanical stuff. I work all over Scotland. I think the best way to show that is distribution of my plant records. You can see a lot of those are from the west coast and those areas that Rory was talking about that are really crucial for these incredible liverworts. I think unfortunately, I'll do the opposite of what Rory did and start with the grim news. And that is that Scotland's habitats really, I think to put it lightly, are pretty knackered in many cases. There's a real lack of continuity in many cases. especially with the woodland cover. I mean, here we've got remnant Pinus sylvestris, our native sort of Caledonian pinewood. This is one of the remnants out on the west coast. Yeah, and on each side, sorry, I should say, I've put a little map so you can see roughly where in Scotland I'm talking about. So yeah, this pinewood is really not regenerated potentially for about 100 years, and then it's been underplanted with Picea sitchensis and Tsuga heterophylla, commercial forestry species. But fortunately, for this particular woodland, they are starting to restore it, but we really are at the very early days of starting to restore ecological functioning across lots of Scotland's landscapes. Peatlands, Scotland has a lot of peatlands, loads and loads of blanket bog, and then raised bogs in the sort of valley floors and along riversides. But a lot of these are very, 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 very degraded. This is just one example, with a lot of erosion features, gullies, and sort of peat hags, as we call them, with drying out peat, and a lot of Racemytrium lanuginosum on the sort of drier peat, where probably once used to be a lot of sphagnum and Eriophorum species. So that's just to sort of set things in context for where these very special communities are now existing. So this is, again, just another example. This is where a lot of our sort of vegetation has become restricted to, is the steep little gullies, typically where herbivores can't reach them. The biggest problem now in Scotland really is our deer population, which is around about 1 million, which is quite a lot of deer for a relatively small patch of ground. But it's becoming a better understood issue slowly. So I'm pretty much going to focus my presentation really on where I look for these oceanic hepatic communities dominated by liverworts, the sorts of sort of the areas that I'd really target if I was wanting to see them, because I think that might be quite useful, especially for those who are perhaps just getting into understanding this habitat, or those who are perhaps working on the fringes of where you might expect to see this habitat, perhaps such as in Sweden, and perhaps even other places in Norway, and even in parts of Scotland that people don't typically think of as being oceanic. You can still find these communities. So the three key things I look for are places that are extremely humid. Quite often this is very easy to find on the west coast of Scotland, but as you get further inland, you're looking for sort of gorges with steep terrain that sort of cling onto the clouds and create their own little microclimates. And then also at certain zone in the hills where the cloud sits quite low, can be quite humid as well, and that's typically where you'll get slightly more boreal montane hepatic mats slightly further east in Scotland. Microclimates created by trees or rocks, and basically this kind of feeds into what the third point, which is north facing, no matter the scale. So if you're looking at a landscape, the best place to look in Scotland would be on a north to northeast facing slope is probably best, because that gets the least sunlight, and for us our prevailing wind comes from the southwest. So fewer desiccating winds, and the sun isn't going to dry stuff out. So this works on a smaller scale too. So even on that hillside in the middle, that's actually sort of kind of southwest facing, but all the boulders there, even just on the little northward side of those boulders, there's little patches of liverwort dominated vegetation. So yeah, I'd say anywhere where you're creating humidity, and particularly in sort of north-facing niches, is really key. And the more structure there is, the better. So this is the first example. We're pretty much just about as far west as we can go in Scotland, all the way out on the Isle of Lewis, or maybe this is even the north of Paris. We're in a sort of coastal gully. So this is a west-facing coastal gully where the water flows out into the sea. But you can see there, the side that I'm stood on, that I've taken the picture from, is basked in sunlight. The other side is dark. It's really dark. It's not getting any sunlight. And that is the side of the gully that all of these amazing little liverworts and all the other associated species are. So in here we've got the Hubertus that Rory was talking about. We've got Scapania gracilis, Mylea taylori, all that sort of stuff, as well as Hymenophyllum wilsoni, Wilson's filmy fern, which is a sort of honorary bryophyte, I suppose you could say, for us. Yeah, and then also in this little gully we've got really hyperoceanic species such as Cololichunia minutissima, Calura calyptrifolia, amazing little carnivorous liverwort, and Radula aquilegia. These tend to be in the sort of spray zone of waterfalls where there is almost no time of year where they're not getting some sort of splash from the river. Slightly further inland, well, I mean, we're on the mainland now, so we're on the west coast of Scotland. That town you can see on the other side of the loch there is Ullapool. And this is a little sort of gully where remnant vegetation has managed to cling on. And this is the sort of temperate rainforest that Rory was talking about. That, yeah, if you take away the trees, you've really got a massive amount of liverwort sort of dominated vegetation. And again, it's the same sort of thing, all these little niches. It helps that there's a river going through it, that increases the humidity, but it probably also helps that there's a canopy over the top of this, which is keeping it really, really damp. So in those, perhaps not here on the west coast where everything's very wet no matter what, but as you start getting further east, this becomes more crucial. So here we've got Plagiochyla spinulosa with a load of Hymenophyllum, and then this is actually on pinus, on pine. I've never seen Lepidosia cupricina growing on pine until this site, so that was quite cool, and Fulinia tamariski, and the usual suspects such as Diplophilum albicans and Scapania gracilis. Rory mentioned, I might mention this particular species. So we're down sort of in the southwest corner of the country on the island of Islay, and you can see that hillside straight ahead of us is completely dark. It probably gets sun even in the summer for maybe 3 hours in the day, and that's right in the morning. It won't be getting any sun in the evening. As soon as that sun's come around, not getting any sun. So that whole hillside there is the sort of habitat that Rory's talking about, where it is a landscape dominated by these leafy liverworts. You can see it's a sort of Calluna dominated heath, and we've got a bit of vaccinium and petrum and a bit of erica in there as well. But you strip that back, and beneath all of that is just this amazing colourful display of quite a wide variety of leafy liverworts, as well as some other amazing species. So the highlight here is the sorry, I've forgotten its name now, Adelanthus lindenbergianus, at one of its 2 Scottish sites. We've also got the Hubertus again. Anastrepta orchidensis is in here. You can see the big purple one there, Pleurosia purpurea, which is another suspected carnivore. I'll let you go and Google that if you want to. But then also in here, we've got quite a lot of sphagnum, the highlight probably being Sphagnum skyense, which is a sort of stable hybrid, I think, restricted to the west coast of Scotland, that's developed in these incredible sort of oceanic climates. So these sorts of habitats, they're very easy to find them in because you're walking over them and everything you're touching is liverwort heath. Despite the health of that sort of liverwort heath there, I do wonder whether, well, I don't wonder, I know that the habitat is extremely altered. And there were tiny little relics, Juniperus communis subspecies nana, this is dwarf or prostrate juniper, just a few scattered plants on the summit, but I can almost imagine the canopy being a little bit taller than is provided by the Calluna there. And if you start getting these junipers building themselves up, it would just provide that extra structure, which I can absolutely imagine these oceanic liverworts just thriving off and forming really nice big hummocks behind. Now this is Ben A National Nature Reserve in the northwest of Scotland. This is, if you want to study liverwort heaths or hepatic mat, this is the site to go to, because it's absolutely covered, and you get it in pretty much every one of its forms. I could have probably done this entire presentation just looking at Bene. But in the submontane and montane zone, we've got a lot of block scree. You'll see again, we still don't have any trees. But yeah, it's amongst block scree and under tall ericaceous shrubs. And this is where you're getting sort of big patches. Here we have the endemic Herbertus borealis, a nice big patch there, but you get a lot of other species in there. There's in that patch, you can kind of see it's quite a golden patch. We've got what I like to call a golden selection, which is Mastigophora woodsii, Plagiochyla carringtoni, Plagiochyla spinulosa, Anastreptorchidensis, these sorts of things. And these heather shrubs are actually a bit taller than in the previous site, and it's because they're controlling the deer numbers. So slightly better. As we move further up the hill, we get into sort of montane alpine zone, and we're still obviously getting them in amongst the steep rock, in amongst the rocks, the boulder scree, but on the steep slopes as well, you start getting them. So here we've got a little patch of Scapania ornithopodioides in amongst, I think that was Sphagnum subnitens. Yeah, and then in amongst the rocks again, you start getting patches of the slightly more montane oceanic species. This is Scapania nimbosa that you can see with the sort of toothed leaves, and then really striking Anastrophyllum donianum, one of our 3 or 4 oceanic Anastrophyllum species. And this one does tend to be more montane, at sort of altitudes over, yeah, sort of 500 meters. As we move downslope, however, we moved into, again, remnant Pinus sylvestris woodland, restricted to the gorge, but in a slightly better state than the ones at the start of the presentation. And we start finding species that typically we do think of as heath species in Scotland. We think it's a oceanic liverwort heath, but here it is surviving very well underneath some really mature Pinus sylvestris stands. So that's Plagiochyla carringtoni with its nice sort of laterally flattened shoots, and even the endemic Herbertus borealis underneath Pinus there. So these sort of maybe challenge some of the received wisdom, or maybe not received wisdom, but challenge the idea that these should be heaths and that they need to remain heaths, because these species clearly do perfectly well underneath a sort of open canopy, which is probably all it would ever be in these quite exposed western areas. An even better example here, this is in Glen Nevis, sort of still quite far west in Scotland, but this is a rocky spur. You can see that remnant Betula sorbus woodland with a bit of salix and even a bit of ulmus and quercus in there, and corylus as well in there as well. This particular spur is perfectly north facing, so it doesn't tend to get a lot of sun apart from early in the morning. And yet these are some of the most amazing stands of hepatic mat that I've ever seen in Scotland, like the lushest, 10 centimeters, 15 centimeters deep, big wefts of Scapania ornithopodioides, Herbertus hutchinsiae, Chlorosia purpurea, Mastigophora woodsii, a bit of Plagiochyla carringtoni in there. But these are seriously some of the sort of lushest bits of hepatic mat I've ever seen. And there's Berthellia chrysocoma in there as well, which is quite often an associate. And you might be able to tell that these are very crispy. I think that comment that was made just in the chat there, they were really seriously pretty dry last year. And I do think that the canopy provided by the trees is going, this is my own sort of interpretation, there's been no science done, but I'd imagine having the canopy over there would make them more robust to these changes in climate, because the microclimate that's sort of maintained by the trees is going to be far better than a microclimate provided by, if you look at the rest of the hill there, it's very open grassland. Those liverworts that are growing out there are going to be far more exposed to the sun and the wind than those growing under the trees. So potentially something to think about in the future. Now you'll see the map in the top left there, we've moved quite a bit further east. This is where you need to start being a bit more picky about where you look. So in this landscape here, you can kind of see the gradient of all the hills. The only place that I found in that area that holds a sort of hepatic mat of sorts is right there, and it's on the steepest, most north-facing slope on the whole sort of that whole area of the glen or the valley. And this vegetation is sort of similar to what I've been describing. It's big block scree, so really massive boulders that have fallen down. This is all granite, and it's, as I say, north-facing, but also under a canopy. And in here we get what, you know, it's not got the sort of classic Plagiochyla or Mystigophora, you know, Herbertus or even the sort of big Scapania species, but it has got a sort of minor hepatic mat, as I'd maybe call it. So this is Visania trilobata, and then we've also got in here, we've got Visania tricronata, Scapania gracilis, and Myla taylori forming a really nice community. And there was actually Lepidosia cupricina in here as well, and an Anastrepta orchidensis. So this is a slightly more boreal hepatic mat, you might be able to say, because this is further east in Scotland. The surrounding landscape is really quite boreal. It's not your temperate rainforest with you know, oak and that sort of stuff. It's pine and birch. And yeah, Rory in his thing, as he was talking about that site on his map that had the two little dots in the cairngorms, where he was saying that's a bit more boreal. I added this in last minute, which is why I don't have a map, but this is some remnant sort of high altitude. So this is about 630-meter birch woodland, which maybe doesn't sound high altitude to a lot of people on the continent, but this is pretty much all we've got left. So I was studying this for my own project, and I was really amazed to see that just, you know, not far, I mean, the trees are literally behind me in this picture here, but underneath the heather again, underneath the Kaluna, this shining mat of vegetation just stood out to me. And again, it was a sort of slightly more minor hepatic mat, but no less sort of staggering. And then I started looking closer and realized that there was actually Plagiochyla carringtoni, which is one of those really amazing proper oceanic species lingering in there. So certainly I'd say if you're starting to see a lot of Visania trilobata, tricronata, Anastrepta, or Mylia in sort of, this isn't the tightest mat you've seen, but it's a sort of loose mat of liverworts. I'd say give it quite a close look, because you never know what else might be lurking in there. So yeah, just to sort of summarize, north-facing niches at any scale, you know, small scale behind a little rock, or at large scale, you know, an entire hillside. Those are the sorts of places I look. So the sheltered microclimates where they're not getting a lot of wind, they're not getting a lot of sun. Open or wooded. I do wonder, I think maybe in Scotland and perhaps in Ireland too, we're lucky, or at least our liverworts are lucky, because we've just got such a wet climate that it doesn't matter as much that we've lost our trees. They're not, they can still cling on just because our climate is so wet. But as you get further east, I do wonder whether the sort of maintenance of that canopy might be quite important. And yeah, most habitats that these oceanic heaths or oceanic communities are existing in Scotland are pretty degraded and heavily altered for the past several centuries, really. In a lot of cases, they're just clinging on in little patches. This is actually Herbertus norennis, which was relatively recently described new to science by, I think, somebody who's viewing at the moment. Pretty sure Neil Bell's in here, or was it a different Neil? I probably got that wrong. Anyway, and I know that in Scotland, where you see it here, it's on a north-facing open hillside in Orkney, this is, which is up one of the Northern Isles. But in Norway, it's growing under a sort of open Betula sorbus canopy. So it suggests to me that, yeah, it's perfectly capable of growing under that sort of wooded canopy. Another one, yeah, and we've got two Anastrophyllum species here. This is Anastrophyllum donianum with those really jagged, pointed, quite distinctive leaves. And then the sort of boat-shaped leaves there are Anastrophyllum alpinum. And certainly I know Anastrophyllum alpinum grows underneath a sort of Juniperus rhododendron montane scrub in the Himalaya. So I see no reason why in Scotland it couldn't exist under a sort of salix juniperus montane scrub sort of habitat where the shrubs are producing or providing that sort of microclimate at higher altitudes to sort of shade them from exposure. And yeah, just a bit of context. I was recently in New Zealand and in some of their sort of submontane silver beech forests, and I have never seen anything like it. I mean, the hepatic mat. I mean, I don't know what else you could possibly describe this as. That's literally everything is hepatic mat. And if you think about it, these forests here have had human impact for about 800 years. Our forests in Scotland have had human impact for, going on 7,000, 6,000, 7,000 years or so since the last ice age. So, perhaps this was normal at one point, before we had a big impact. Yeah, and I think that's me done. Just finishing off on some lovely pictures of some lovely species, I think. Yeah, I hope that was useful. And yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions if we've got them, if we've got time.
Yeah, that's very useful. I have some interesting comments that I use in the summary later. Thank you. I think you can see the chat, right? The chat.
I should be able to open it. Yeah. Cool.
And you can have it. It isn't that many questions straight off.
We'll scroll up to where. Oh, here we go. Desiccation and.
Yeah, if you go into the questions and answers, Jeanette Hall has some questions.
Cool. I'll just double check this one. Okay, we'll close that one. Where's the Q&A?
I can maybe read up a question in the meantime here from the chat, and then I will.
Yeah.
So in the chat, there's a question. What would you say is the ideal density of Scots pine to maintain the hepatic mat beneath it in a warming climate?
Difficult to say, because a lot of our Scots pine woodlands are so altered, and the ground flora hasn't had very good continuity. Quite often it's been heavily trampled or heavily grazed, so we've lost our ericaceous shrubs, and liverworts don't really like getting stamped all over by deer or sheep or cattle, or they've been burnt, so we've kind of lost that continuity. And I can see some conflicting ideas around how woodland might impact our oceanic communities, particularly because often in Scotland, when we start getting regeneration going, it's quite dense, high density regeneration of betula and sorbus initially. I always feel like that's kind of that's what happens when you completely open up a habitat and it has to start all over again. Initial sort of colonization by trees will be pretty dense, but it should even out and open up, and you start getting the pine in there, which forms a slightly higher canopy, and the birch starts opening up as well. But I mean, this is probably like a several hundred-year-old process, or several hundred-year process before we start getting the sort of equilibrium that would mean that we've got a canopy whilst it's not too sort of too dense a canopy. But in terms of what would be ideal, it's probably the sort of thing where I don't know if I'll be able to blast back to this one here. That's pretty good, honestly. Underneath a lot of that, those ericaceous shrubs, beneath the pine there, is mats of really amazing hepatic mat. So it's quite an open canopy. And I think just by the nature of the ground flora, because you've got really tall, I mean, some places the heather, the Kaluna can be almost a meter tall. And that means that there's a lot of competition for new trees coming up. So you're not going to get really dense regeneration of pine. It's going to be occasionally a pine will find a regeneration niche where it can start growing, often on another fallen tree or something like that, and it will fill that canopy gap, but you're never going to have really dense closed canopy forest. Yeah, just because of the nature of the competition that's provided by the understory. Yeah, something like that. I wouldn't be able to sort of put a figure on it, stems per hectare, but something like that
Yeah.
seems to be absolutely fine.
Sounds like a good answer. I need to stop there, I think.
Yeah, no worries.
There's more questions in the questions and answers, but we'll take them later. We need a break. Well, it's time for break, 10 minutes, and then it's Scandinavia, and you'll see some woodlands.
Nice.
It's funny with your
Nice break.
remnants. You talked about the woodland with 3 trees on it, so.
Yeah, that's what we're working with.
But if you stop sharing, I'll take over.